So what I think of as being the number one criteria, and it's the one that I'm going to make a strong vote for. The rest of them I'm less attached to, is the idea that the definition of core should be small and stable so that things are not ever going out of core. This is the stable for all time proposal, which really means that the least number or amount of must-test pass is probably best for the community because they can rely on them. And this corollary that the least amount of change from the current requirements as possible, which I think somebody else typed up, but I'm not exactly sure what they mean. Was that yours?
That was one of the ones I had said. Yeah.
Do you see that as being related to the same thing, the stability argument?
Well, I see there's two things. One is we want to make sure the tests are reliable in multiple environments. No, I actually think it's a question of the code underneath the test also. So that's where I was going with that, with one of my comments. And I think it's the same. What you're looking for is we must pass tests. You're more likely to have a must pass test if you're talking about test code that's been stable for releases, right? And APIs that have been stable for multiple releases.
Right. So I guess as the open discussion point, does anyone see this as being not a valid criteria or conversely not broad enough?
I'm kind of presuming here that this is criteria like for the first round of tests, and then over time we'll be growing the set of tests to increase the amount of interoperability between clouds.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's just for test revision.
I'm sorry you missed the previous DefCore kickoff, but the goal is definitely to have a set of tests that are declared as must-have for each release cycle. What we're trying to do right now is get a set of tests that apply to Havana by Icehouse. So we'll be a full release behind, and then to catch up by the J release, I believe, so that we're actually announcing tests concurrent with that release. Yeah, so I think.
So I assume that the test will be labeled with a version as well. If you pass the test, you pass the test for version X, right?
Yes, absolutely. And we had a bit of a discussion last week on the mechanics of making sure that RefStack and the Tempest suite that's being used is at a specific version and tag, and that it's really a moment in time that all of these tests passed, where vendors are free to improve operations over time, but they need to be able to go back and demonstrate that their product is still compliant with their previous certification. And this is really the idea of saying unless the API is explicitly deprecated, support for it should not be abandoned once it's in core. We got Monty on the pad. Is Monty on the phone?
So does this mean that by introducing this test, we will block the ability to have a deprecation in the API later on?
I don't believe so, but I think we've explicitly punted for this cycle how a must-have test would be removed from criteria. And I think that's probably appropriate. I think we should be especially cautious about churning core. We shouldn't really be saying, oh, we changed our mind, that's not core anymore.
So I don't know about you guys, but I'm wondering if we are not trying to go a little further than what our collective ability are going to be. Maybe the definition of what tests should be passing or not should be done by the project itself. We should give them some guidelines, but not preempt what those tests are. You see what I mean?
We spent the last year debating that particular thing and arrived at this conclusion already, so I don't want to argue it over again in this meeting. Sorry, I'm going to keep us on topic. I mean, that was the conclusion that the board voted on, that this was in the scope of this committee and of the board to make these determinations.
The choice of having tests is definitely within the project. The project should create whatever tests they think are necessary.
But the choice of which tests should be our committee only, correct? Is that what?
I don't actually.
Yeah.
Hold on. That's a criteria question to me, right? There's actually one of the criteria I added was that there's a community aspect of data coming in, right? And I think it's reasonable to add a criteria that says that the test has been endorsed by the project as a must-pass test. It's perfect. That's a very reasonable criteria to include. It's not the only criteria.
Let's debate that criteria separately. I mean, if we can finish with one at a time, let's make no progress. So I explicitly do not want to rehash the scope of the committee or the subcommittee today. That's why we've been doing this for years, to make some forward progress. So back on the is stable for a long time or all time a reasonable candidate for a criteria that could be applied to tests?
Josh, this is Lou. Yeah, I think the intent is to be stable, but I do think we also need to have versioning. We need to be able to say, if you are, Essex, you pass these tests. Because someone may never move off of Essex and they still want to maintain.
Yeah, very, very true. I mean, the proposal is that the certifications were provided are as per a particular version, as per a particular named release.
Right.
I think we should probably call out.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but if you're not talking, please mute. We're getting a lot of chop. Thank you.
If we're, I do think we need to acknowledge that we don't have an explicit mechanism for deprecating APIs in as much as if the tests are still in Tempest and they were must-have in the last cycle, the expectation is probably that they would be must-have in the next cycle. If the tests themselves are deprecated by the project or the TC, then the scope of this effort is specifically that we can only choose from tests that have been provided by the technical community. So that would really say deprecation is back in the hands of the technical project leaders.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to make sure we kept in that, because I generally think that the idea that once it's in core, it should stay in core is the right principle and it should not move. But I wouldn't want to do that to the detriment of allowing the TC and the PTLs to make decisions within a project that deprecates something. So as long as we have a mechanism that still preserves that capability and doesn't sort of hold some old feature hostage that maybe a project doesn't want to maintain, I think the idea of it starts small and it essentially only grows. I mean, there's a certain degree of backward compatibility or backward functionality. I think is exactly where we want to start from.
But version to version, I do think it's reasonable for us to say as a requirement that the technical committee could say, this test is no longer a valid test. We don't think it's a must-pass test. I'm more concerned about adding must-pass tests than removal of must-pass tests.
Yeah.
And so
in general, I hope we're preserving backward compatibility across the APIs, even if these things transition, and this shouldn't be an issue. But
so we are maintaining backwards compatibility, but we are adding new versions that are kind of parallel versions. So I think that the criteria here is about, before you add a test that locks into a specific version, we're saying, we're going to be committed to this, maintaining this version for, I don't know, a year, 2 years, something like that. And, if the TC are going to kind of sign off as this being something that is valid to say is going to be around for a year, 2 years, they need to understand what the project is committing themselves to, and that they shouldn't be saying an API is required if it's planned for deprecation in like 6 months' time or something. So we have like that case in the Glance V1, V2 API as an example.
Can I just clarify something real quick, which is at least my understanding of the thing, because unfortunately, as with every other thing in OpenStack, all of these words have at least 12 meanings. that the thing that we're talking about for this purpose in terms of must-have tests are tests of capabilities, not necessarily tests of.
We started this call by rehashing exactly that definition. You dialed in 15 minutes late and missed the definition. I'm sorry. We're never going to make any progress if we go back every time somebody dials in.
Can you just say yes or no?
Yes. We're talking about capabilities and not the underlying test itself.
Great. Thanks. I just wanted to make sure. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. There is an explicit mapping because, as pointed out, board members are not programmers. Some of us notwithstanding.
Yeah. Thanks. That's fantastic.
Okay, I'm going to move this one up into agreed upon criteria unless somebody has a strong objection to it. That as a basic criteria for looking at these, we should ensure that we're saying this should be core because we expect it to be core for a long time.
Yep.
Okay.
I'm reviewing.
We want to take a contentious one? I'm proposing.
I want to make sure that there's a concrete way that I totally agree with the sentiment. I just want to make sure we have something that is specific so that it helps us clarify.
Well, let's maybe take this in piecemeal because I think two other tests are going to easily add to this, or two other criteria will easily add to this, and will be much more contentious. So I want to take them in
this is not an individual test, or maybe this is. Or do you mean this to apply to all tests or as individual tests?
Sorry, I'm confused.
So for this criteria, stable, can we number it?
Yeah, criteria 1.
I could do that. Criteria 1. So what we're saying is that a test is stable for a long time. Test is expected to be stable, right?
Yes.
It's required. It's really required.
Yeah, that's actually the better, not that the capability underneath is, but that the test itself is.
Right. Here we go.
Given that we are supposedly all lawyers, shall we take the is not legally encumbered as a given? Anyone want to argue that one?
Certainly.
Well,
I mean, we can't even accept code into the project that's legally encumbered.
Sorry, say again?
I mean, we don't even accept code into the project that's legally encumbered, right? So yeah, I would take that as a given.
Well, we have actually. We have AWS API support that is questionable in the project now. So the ramifications of this criteria is saying that AWS API support could never be part of core.
I love that we're all lawyers. This is always so much fun. I would say that one would be, I'd agree that it shouldn't be legally encumbered, and that then the argument there would be, then the lawyers have to argue whether or not we would have to have a legal opinion as to whether AWS is encumbered, which I believe there's difference of opinion. I mean, I'm fine with us having a thing that gets us with no AWS as core. I'm personally okay with that. I think that we get into the weird place where, for that example, there's folks who think it is and folks who think that it isn't, and I love the legal stuff.
And that's really a question, as you stated, Josh, for the lawyers. I mean, if we're trying to say something, I mean, we should come up with the technical definition of what we think legally encumbered means, or not legally encumbered.
I think it's fair to say that we want it to not be legally encumbered, but I don't think we can define whether or not it is legally encumbered or not, because none of us are lawyers.
Right, so let's use as a criteria instead that we believe actually that the Legal Affairs Committee of the Foundation has voiced an opinion that it is not of extraordinary risk. Because they're never going to say it's risk-free. There's no such thing as risk.
Right.
Well, it's not really their call either. It's the legal counsel for the foundation. They're just advisory.
So wait a second.
Right.
So from that perspective, then we can handle that someplace else.
Yeah,
right.
Leave it out. Leave it out. It's going to be a whole rat's nest of things that we would have to enumerate.
Okay.
So I think in a way, one of the ways to handle this is that what we're saying is there is none of the sub-communities in OpenStack objects to this test being included. I'm a little bit concerned about the double negative, but what we're saying is there's no legal concern, there's no technical concern, there's no user, right? I mean, there's effectively, are we going to allow tests to be blackballed by a subset of the community? Is really the criteria question.
Maybe we can just assume that it's going to be subsumed by other criteria like that. It's available in multiple public clouds. If it's seriously legally encumbered, then we can kind of assume that it's not going to be. Right, but I guess I'm going back to a subset of that criteria, which is there a veto power for these tests? Because that's a rejection criteria is helpful because that's a veto power.
So the veto power would be for legal to say it's legally encumbered, or it could be legally encumbered?
Yeah. Veto would be, is there any community inside OpenStack that has veto? In other words, does the TC, does the user committee, does the legal affairs committee, does the foundation staff, for any particular reason, the docs community, if they feel like it is impossible to document appropriately, etc. I mean, I would say no. I would say the point of making this a committee process is that there hasn't been an easy and emergent consensus on the details, and I think the likelihood is we will have somebody who objects to every test.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. So let's not.
Can we keep this pretty high level and out of a lot of the process questions? There's so much more meaty stuff I think I would like to get sort of work from the top down, the major things, and then get into some of these details that may be contentious.
That's fine.
Okay. Demonstrated extensibility seems easy because it was approved in the guiding principles already. So this is more really a restatement. Any problems with that one?
Demonstrated extensibility, is this where we're talking about what we started off with, the idea of a plug-in architecture or something? I mean, that's all because that's not really a test criteria issue as much as it is a functionality, or it's something behind the test. And so I was just trying to figure out if you were saying the tests need to be extensible, or if the thing that's being tested needs to be extensible.
The capability itself needs to be demonstrated as extensible. In other words, if there is a create volume, I'm going to use create volume as an easy example. If there's create volume as a test in Tempest, it would be a good criteria for us to say, if we're going to say create volume is a must-have, are there multiple back-end drivers that demonstrate create volume?
But I can see some tests where, like the functionality that you're trying to test for, you wouldn't necessarily need to have an extensible capability behind it. I mean, there's some things that we're going to want it done only the OpenStack way with the OpenStack code, most likely.
Right, that's the designated section rule. But I think, so I guess the meta question is, do we think all criteria should apply to all test capabilities tests, or can we include criteria that should be applied when relevant?
The latter.
How do you decide what's relevant? Like, for example, the test can be specific. I'll just give a concrete example here. The Nova key pair API, for example, doesn't have multiple storage backends. Do we say that can't be required because it's not extensible? How do you define when it's relevant?
Is it intended to be extensible as far as the Nova project leads are concerned?
No, I don't think so.
Well, then it doesn't need to be. So demonstrated extensibility is for things that are intended to be extensible, there should be some demonstration that the extensibility works. Right?
Let's talk through the rationale for this, right? So the rationale would be that somebody promotes a test as must pass that locks an implementation in that we actually want to encourage pluggability. And so yes, the purpose of this criteria is to say, hey guys, look, we really can't pass this test because the way you're storing objects should be pluggable, and it's not. And so we're
Yeah,
not going to pass the test at this point.
So it goes to the question of how to decide which should be pluggable and which shouldn't. Why should it be pluggable how objects are stored but not key pairs? So
well, no, why pluggable is a technical community decision. But let's take Keystone as an example. There was a decision to say Keystone should have pluggable backends. But the reality is there isn't feature parity in Keystone across the backends for some capabilities. So we really couldn't say these capabilities should be must-have because they only work on certain backends in a case where we've explicitly said multiple backends should be supported.
Right. So this is like, as another example, file injection in the Zen driver rather than in the other drivers is a thing that is backend implementation specific rather than a thing that actually works across the extensibility matrix, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So
in that case, if that's what this is pointing at, then I'm totally did it.
So how about we talk about consistent behavior across plugins then, because that's what we're talking about.
Yeah,
where there are plugins, we expect consistent behavior.
There's two
my thought would
things.
be kind of the way we said it, where we don't want it to be implementation specific. As opposed to each one has to have multiple ways to implement. What we don't want to do is have it limited to a specific backend implementation. That's more of an inclusion criteria.
Yeah, Rob's got that written down in his thoughts as test is not configuration specific.
Right, so I've just restated that as where the code has an extension framework, there should be parity in capability across backends. Is that, or extensions instead of backends, but is that close to what we're all trying to say?
Yes. I would like to bring. I'll bring in my language about not being configuration specific.
Yes. I think that's appropriate.
I think we are going to hit some limits when we are going to be looking at that from the perspective of Neutron. I'd love to have Mark McLean on the line, but I believe that Neutron plugins are widely different even for the elements that are core. So we may have trouble with that.
The elements that are core by definition cannot be widely different. That's what we're saying. The plugins can be totally widely different, but the things that are widely different can't be core.
Yeah, I think that's actually
they remain extensions only, and that the extensions, since they are vendor specific, should not be a part of core.
Correct.
In this revision of core, in this iteration of core.
Correct.
Okay.
But this actually gets a little bit away from one of the places we were going, which was that for the tests to have a preference for pluggable implementations.
That's a separate criteria.
I think you're right.
No, but the idea is that the pluggable implementations should give the same behavior to the user of the APIs.
Yes.
Right. Because what we're trying to achieve with this whole thing is that users can use these things and expect behavior without having to, be tied into some sort of vendor's implementation.
Or even to know what the details of the vendor implementation are. Yeah.
Exactly.
So I would object to a criteria that says that we should favor capabilities that are based on extensions, simply because I think it is appropriate for us to have some OpenStack projects that have capabilities with which there is only one implementation, and that's perfectly fine. And there are others where we have, as a community, have decided that we should have multiple implementations, and that's also fine. So I don't think we necessarily want a criteria that says things are more likely to be in core if they are a plugin framework.
I have very mixed feelings about that.
Okay, well let's bring it through.
I feel like we're mixing up two different ideas, which is one is, there's this idea of what code or what implementation or projects should be, considered for core, and then there's the test. that actually, what the must-pass tests are. And I'm not sure I understand how pluggability impacts the selection of the tests and functionality, other than you obviously want them to behave the same way across plugins. I do see what they affect the part.
That's something that was covered very extensively in the DefCore committee proper, and probably will be recapped again a couple of times. But
okay, sorry about that.
Yeah, it's okay. Today's debate is not really I mean, there is no framework for us to say this project will or won't be part of core. The only thing we're addressing is these capabilities of this project will or won't be part of must-have.
Right. I guess I'm trying to figure out exactly how pluggability is manifested in the selection of must-have tests. That's where I'm not clear what Rob's trying to say there.
So, well, this is part of my expectation for this is that there is a cultural and objective component for this. Not objective as in there are objectives we want to achieve and maintain in the project. And I think that we should be willing to talk about those as these criteria. So it could be that what I said was very contentious and you're like, no way, I don't want that as a criteria. There's another part which says, hey, wait a second, it is useful for us to encourage pluggability in the projects, and our criteria could reflect that.
Yeah,
I believe the way.
I think we are missing two things here.
Yeah, I think I agree with what Troy was saying, which is that I agree. I think it is a thing that we as a community want to encourage and that we want. But I think that in this particular case, it's not. It's a goal for a project. It's not really. I'm not really sure that I could, looking at a test, I could tell whether that test meets that criteria, because a implementation would fail that test if it behaved differently. Like the test of the capability isn't going to be a
I think there's an element of these are tests that are applied to projects broadly, and I think that it could be possible to say a test in you cannot have a must-pass test in a project if that project does not have a pluggability model, and I think that could actually be a criteria.
I agree it could be a criteria. I would object to the criteria.
Because?
Because I don't think that a plug-in model is always an unmitigated good. I think there are projects and portions of projects that would be best served by having a single monolithic implementation that works really well.
Yeah.
I mean,
I agree with that.
NovaNet. I would love to say NovaNet should be core because it works and it's fielded in 70% of OpenStack deployments. Neutron demonstrably does not work, does not have feature parity, and nobody uses it. I mean, just to be as a particularly pointed example.
Yeah, but that same example creates problems, because making it a core test when it's been deprecated potentially creates problems, right? It doesn't pass one of our requirements, which is that it's not expected to be stable because it's deprecated.
Well,
so
I think it'll be undeprecated.
Part of what we're doing with this is steering where we expect things to go, and I think that the fact that NovaNet is a poor example, because we actually have issues with the fact that it's not pluggable and extensible. The fact that it works is not a factor of its monolithicness. It's a factor.
I'd say in terms of steering where we want things to go, it's in the realm of interoperability, not in the realm of project behavior or encouraging projects, to take certain technical decisions. We want to encourage interoperability in the marketplace here, and so I don't see how demanding pluggability helps that or is relevant to that.
We also want to encourage a multi-vendor ecosystem.
Yes.
And so pluggability is actually essential to encourage a multi-vendor ecosystem. And so these are actually very real concerns.
And I'm not certain that is absolutely the case, although I think you're probably right. But I think in terms of the testing, in terms of defining the testing for interoperability, I think that the criteria that Josh was expressing earlier is right on and is the criteria that I think is important here, which is that if there are multiple backends for a capability, we expect them to work the same, right? That's the interoperability thing that we're trying to drive home here. I think that the discussion about whether or not we want to encourage pluggability or not, I think is a broader discussion than this thing that we're doing here today. And I think it's a worthwhile discussion to have, but I think that it's a much scarier it's a much broader can of worms.
I second Monty.
Can I propose that we take this one into a bucket of highly contentious, and that we come at it after we've plowed through a little bit of other stuff? Because I think it will be easier to discuss this one if we have some of the other criteria nailed down.
Agreed.
The other thought, for Rob, from my perspective, I think you've swayed me that it is a worthwhile thing for OpenStack itself to encourage pluggability, but I think I agree with Monty, as dangerous as that is, that it's a bit late for us to be doing that in DefCore, and that as a technical decision, it needs to be something the TC is driving back into the projects to say we favor code that supports extensions.
think that we need to look at the levers that we have to encourage the behaviors that we think are important.
I think
this is part of what we're doing.
That's true.
But sure. Also, on the other hand, you're talking in this case about a lever for the board to use towards the TC, and I think that the board should be careful about doing that unless the TC has taken behavior so far I'd say that if anything, we have erred on the side of more pluggability than we should have. If we have erred, if this has gone in the wrong direction, I believe it's gone wrong in the direction of making all of the things pluggable to the extension of sanity. And so I think that we probably don't have to spend a lot of time in encouraging making sure that things are pluggable. That seems to be working pretty well.
Can we take an easy high pass filter on this and say that we believe that whole projects should probably be extensible, or in other words, the way, Rob, you framed this most recently, tests will not be considered for projects without an extension framework, but I don't think that every capability necessarily needs to be extensible, and that was my
right.
I totally agree with this. Right, guys, we're not trying to dictate technical terms. I'll tell you from the spider analysis we did, pluggability is important for the ecosystem success and for adoption. Yeah. That was one of the overwhelming things that we saw. The criteria is a place where the board directs, and I think it's entirely appropriate for us to make sure that the criteria reflect the direction we want the project to go.
Yeah, and that's true.
Sure. Yeah, I was just basically saying. I was just saying. I think that it's. I think we can say that pretty broadly, and don't have to spend a lot of It seems that there's not a lot of people pushing in the opposite direction on that. I don't think we have to invest a lot of effort in making sure that happens right now. Other things.
Interestingly, this ended up. I agree with you. I don't think this should be a contentious topic.
The reason it's contentious is because of Swift. And the reason it's contentious is because people want a Swift Ceph combination or something like that. And the Swift that is actually in work. And so I think that as that gets there, this will cease being a thing that people even bring up. Because it's basically when they say things in general should be pluggable, what they're trying to say is I think Swift should have plugins and somebody should force them to do it. So
yeah, just to clarify, since I expressed some concern initially, I don't have concern about the idea of pluggability at the project layer. When I first read this, I thought we were trying to say that every test had to have a multiple backend implementation, and that felt like that went too far.
Yeah.
And that was my concern, is that we were doing it at the test level. I do think, a different alternative I thought was we use in some cases that a higher weighting or a higher value would be placed on tests that meet certain criteria, and I guess in this case I could see that things that do run across multiple backends consistently might have a higher weight, but I just don't know that we want to get to the point of saying, well, we'd never have a test or we'd never have a project that didn't have plugins in core. That seems a little too far.
That's one of the things I actually like is there's a question of should we be considering a weighting.
Yeah, and I think we should. In fact, I think if we just think of the criteria as being should, or improves the likelihood, as opposed to every test must display these characteristics, then we're going to be able to exercise sane judgment.
I agree with that.
I agree.
Okay. Can I cram in one other not contentious, or if it is contentious, I'll be very surprised, which is service discoverable. And the proposal here is just that since we founded OpenStack on the idea that we're Python lovers and we believe in introspection, and we spent a lot of time working on making sure that the various endpoints could be discovered by querying Keystone, I would suggest that at least at the project level, we should never have a must-have project that cannot be discovered from a single endpoint. In other words, the way RefStack is built is you only get an endpoint and you've got to be able to run the test from there.
Right.
So are you talking about the service or are you talking about the function? Meaning, is it...
If the service returns a valid identification of version, then we can rely on the service plus the version to know what capabilities should be available.
Sounds fair to me.
I think that I don't right now in this call need to quibble over them. I think that the wording of that could be better, but I think that I agree with what you just said and in general, and I'm fine to move on with it, and we can always come back and mince, I would invite mince over wording.
Because I agree the wording is not so good.
Is this a project level thing? So not what the test.
No, I think it actually, that's the thing, is I think that right now it's written so it sounds like it's a project level thing. I think this actually does describe something that is talking about capabilities, and without saying a paragraph of text, that doesn't come across. And so that's the note that Josh took, that I will work on fixing that wording or something like that. Yeah, because
but does that then hit things like Oslo or where it's basically under the covers? But are we just saying that's not a component?
I think if various elements of a service have different if there are different things that you can do, that needs to be discoverable automatically from the first. So basically, like, you shouldn't have to, as a user, to go all the way back out to the user thing. You shouldn't have to have special knowledge about the OpenStack cloud you're running against to be able to use capabilities that may or may not be there depending on the deployer's choices. That should be something that should be discoverable for things that we do think that are sort of valid to possibly be or possibly not be there, that you should be able to programmatically discover that from your initial endpoint to the capability in question. Or else, if that is not the case, then that is not a good candidate for being something we consider to be a thing.
As an explicit example, you need to be able to say, hey, do I know if floating IPs work or not without simply trying to bind a floating IP or allocate a floating IP and have it fail?
Right, that's right.
I understand the concept. The thing that I find a little bit circular is that the definition of these tests are ones that you would be able to, by definition, expect to be there. So the fact that they're discoverable, I'm not sure is really a requirement for them. They are, right? If we're including them in this list, they must be there. It doesn't matter if they're discoverable or not. It's a good thing to have. But I don't know. That might be a requirement describing a characteristic that any of the may have tests must display. Of the common test?
That's a good point. I mean, if this seems self-evident, I would still like to leave it in because I think this ends up being useful for the tools community and the docs community to understand how they can consume the must-have capabilities.
Well, no, I think that Rob's point is that if it's a must-have capability, I don't need to discover it because it damn well has to be there.
Right.
But if it's a may-have and I want to consume it, I need to be able to discover that it's whether or not it's there.
Exactly.
Because if I can't count on it being there, then it can't be must-have.
No,
we don't have version definition in the API, so I would recommend that everything should be discoverable, or we add version definition in the API.
Well, I think everything should be discoverable. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying for a must-have capability, discoverability is a moot point on a must-have capability because it's a must-have capability.
Define must-have, because must-have varies on each version. So if you don't have the version number, you won't know what is a must-have.
We're not arguing if this is a good capability. It's definitely a good capability. The question is,
I'm more laying groundwork for the upcoming problems of OpenStack compatible and the sort of nearly core. So I can imagine a cloud, for instance, that's deployed without any S3 or Swift support. And I can imagine a mark that allowed that, but that required that it was easy to discover from the service catalog that Swift wasn't present. See, and so if we make it a requirement, say, if it's in core, you for sure know that you can discover that it's by looking at the...
I see what you're saying. Okay, I see what you're saying, and yes, I
right. It's an interesting argument. Can you capture that as a sub point? That's really interesting. And this is one of those behavioral ones where I do think that we're incenting behavior for people. I'm worried that there's going to be some base thing that we want to make sure is tested that isn't discoverable. And I mean, Nova Network is I guess one of those classic. It's that type of thing.
Neutron is not
the layer.
Neutron is not discoverable because you can't tell if it's Neutron or Nova Network except by doing a list of list networks call. But
so
in the Nova,
if we're applying this to Havana, is this then going to? Oh, that's going to kick out all those APIs, which is fine. Let me ask it this way: what's the impact of this criteria? What are we going to include?
Well, if we're soft with applying this criteria and we only apply it at the project level instead of at a lower level around introspection, I think we're fine. In other words, I'm pretty sure that all of the service endpoints we run today are exposed in Keystone in the service catalog with a version. And then we can be more harsh with applying it at a capability level later on.
Yeah, I think that's the way you have to think about it, because you can certainly tell, that Nova is there, but you don't necessarily know whether the floating IP extension is there. And that doesn't necessarily mean you would exclude that lower level feature just because you can't introspect a particular function call versus a service.
Right. Or to put a really fine point on it, the API key extension that Rackspace and HP both run, you have to know about it before talking to Keystone in the first place, before you know to use it, because you can't ask an unauthenticated Keystone whether or not it has that extension, and therefore you would like to use an API key rather than a password. So you have to have pre-existing knowledge.
So we should kill them all.
Well, I've tried to. I keep deleting that code and it keeps coming back.
Should we move on?
Good, and a good discussion about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
These two I think will be easy, but I think the nuance will be hard. Works on multiple public cloud services and works on multiple private cloud products. The notion being, if people are using it, it is probably a good argument that it could be part of core.
I think that one's tricky. So I wrote an argument about this one down. I think it might be in Rob's thing, because he said something very similar, and I think I tried to but I can summarize it really quickly. I agree with the sentiment here. I think that my concern is that we've seen this actually a couple of times now. Designate is actually, I think, the biggest example of this, where we have everybody pretty much agrees that we need the capability inside of OpenStack. We're waiting on more people to step up and use it, and the people are waiting for us to say that it's in OpenStack before they start using it. Right. So we wind up with this circular problem.
Well, I think with the philosophy that criteria is a weighting and a should, and we should use expert judgment, I think we're still in a position to say, even though this capability is not in multiple public clouds, so the problem is we can't call it core and then take the use of the mark away from a bunch of public cloud providers.
I
Right.
I would love to do that, but I'm an ass.
So would I, as long as timing is a reasonable rollout, that they have a couple of weeks to get into that kind of compliance. But I agree that if we put the criteria in and say we are certainly favoring things that are proven to be used, but the committee can obviously apply expert judgment to say, users have been clamoring for this and there is pressure from the user committee to support it, even though it is not completed yet.
Yeah. So I think that would assuage my concerns with that, because the goal there I totally agree with, right? And so my main concern is that we just don't get ourselves into a catch-22.
Hey, this is leading us to an interesting question about weighting, WEIGH, and it's possible that one of the things that we should do in our next meeting is actually look and see if there's a reasonable system of weights, because at the end of the day, if we can say, okay, something that's in multiple public clouds and multiple private clouds gets a weight of 10, whatever 10 ranks out to with everything else, we're going to end up with a force rank of all these tests, and there hopefully will be an obvious cliff between the must pass and the commons and the edge. Is it worth saying in a future meeting we're actually going to look at a weight scoring system for these tests? And that would, in a way, make a lot of these conversations simpler.
I think it makes sense. We're almost implying that in the language that we're using in there already. I don't know when we can get to something that specific, but I think it also begins to introduce how you can factor in things like if we have community voting, if we have PC input, like all those things become, some weighted factor, and then you score the test, and the ones at the top are the must have, I think is what you're saying.
Yeah, what I'm thinking is that we can actually do it based on data. If we say, all right, look, we actually want to have weights of these items, then once we actually have the items, we can just leave the weights sort of open, knowing that when we've started actually scoring things, then we're going to end up being able to turn the knobs a little bit.
I would be a bit more firm than this by saying, okay, we're going to define a set of criteria that are going to be applicable in 6 months or in a year, and if you've made a choice not to follow these criteria within that time frame, then you lose the right to use the name. Because if we say, oh, we'll have to wait until everybody implements everything before we can test it, then nobody will ever implement anything.
That's what we're doing. That is why we're starting out applying criteria to Havana, which will be obviously 6 months behind, but with a goal of catching up to current releases so the criteria comes out with the release. And then obviously the way the trademark policy is phrased is you have the right to use the mark as long as what you're shipping is within two major revisions of trunk. So you can continue to say it's OpenStack compatible if it's OpenStack Grizzly compatible until Icehouse, right? Or until the J release, I guess.
Until J, yeah.
So I think
these aren't going to sneak up on people. They're going to be icebergs.
Eileen is going to call me and say, "What do you mean you took HP can't call it OpenStack anymore?"
Yeah.
Then there will be death and bleeding. Can we?
At that point, you'll say you had a year's warning.
Yes.
For getting around.
All right, we have a contentious one that I think if folks haven't done the homework, it's going to be hard. Who has not read Shuttleworth's proposal?
So I have not read Shuttleworth's proposal. I'd like to read it.
Yeah, I've not read it.
Yeah, let him know.
Okay.
Can you toss a link in here just for, or where do I find the link? Is it in one of the other things?
It's a Google Doc, and I will see if I can find it.
Okay. Thank you.
In the previous two DefCore meetings, I think the general consensus was to not adopt the bulk of Shuttleworth's proposal because it's a little overreaching for what we're trying to do right now. But there was one particular criteria that were interesting that came up in discussion that I started calling the Shuttleworth test. And the logic, to summarize, I will give you this link, although I'm not sure if I can actually share the doc with you.
I'll go.
No, I can't.
Yeah, I can read it offline, over the next week or something like that, just for edification.
The logic is, and this was most specifically the example was heat. For some OpenStack capabilities and projects that have to be run by the operator of the cloud. In other words, Node has to be run on the physical hosts and with admin access to the hypervisor. There are other OpenStack projects, including Heat and Savannah, that can be run by a user of an OpenStack cloud and don't have to be run by the operator. And so the proposal of the Shuttleworth test was that things that have to be run by the operator are a better candidate for core because a user can always run the other things themselves if they want them, but they can't do anything about things that have to be run by an operator.
So this one, you obviously know that there's going to be contention on that. I think that can't be run by the user is a little bit strong. I think that one of the ways that I've been having some discussions about this point, which I think is actually in general, I think there is a good test in here, right? And that's things that are more advantageous or that make more sense for the operator to run than for the user to run, because actually there's a large portion of things inside of, the only thing the operator really has to run is like Keystone and the hypervisor things. A lot of the other stuff can actually run in VMs themselves. And that gets us to a micro cloud. And so I think none of us are suggesting that. But there are
I think some of us are suggesting that. So I would be very careful to summarize other people's position. I think the proposal that only Nova, Cinder, Swift, Keystone, and possibly Glance should be core is not a microcloud. That is the original definition of OpenStack.
No. I'm saying right here what you're saying gets us to a place you can run Glance in the cloud. You can run the Nova API servers in the cloud weirdly. You can go nuts on this, right? But I know what you're saying in general. As I was saying of cannot gets us potentially to a weird place.
I agree. I think the line between can't and shouldn't is a dangerous minefield. I think there is an easy test to say it can't at all ever be run by a user, and therefore it for sure should be in core, is a useful test. If people want it and they have no way to run it themselves, it better be in core. If it is generally, so I'm not saying the converse. I'm saying only things that have to be run by the operator should be core. I'm just saying things that can't be run by the user are very strong candidates for core.
Yeah.
Now, whether things that for which it would be convenient to have a multi-tenant implementation should be core is a separate set of criteria.
Right.
Why would we say that simply because a test has to be run by the operator that has higher relevance to what we're trying to achieve, which is like interoperability, than something else? I don't see that it has any bearing on anything. Well, interoperability has two characteristics, right? It has if you think of a failure of interop as being the amount of pain, the magnitude of pain times the number of people, then a small amount of pain for lots of people is a certain index, and a large amount of pain for a few people is another index. So moving from a cloud that has a capability to a cloud that doesn't, but that you could add it, is a small amount of pain, and it might impact a lot of people. But moving from a cloud that has a capability, even if it's the only cloud that had that capability, to a cloud that doesn't have that capability and that you can't add is a huge amount of pain, although maybe to a smaller number. But
I got confused
but
by that.
I don't understand
Yeah.
why there's added weight to tests that are only run by an admin.
No,
I
not
think
tests.
Here's the rationale that I think Mark was trying to get to. His goal is small core.
Right.
And the idea is that if you have a capability that can run inside of OpenStack based on the core, then don't add it to the core because somebody can add it.
Right. I know that's the
remember,
intent of it.
we're not saying that a cloud won't offer this. We're not saying that Rackspace will stop offering Glance. Not at all. What we're saying is that Glance might not be core because even if it's missing, you could still install it. So if core's there,
that's kind of circular. I don't think that adds anything to it. If I want to run Swift totally virtualized on top, that doesn't mean that it's less important. And
that's why this isn't the only criteria.
Kind of a backwards argument saying that the first thing that we want to see in core, those things only that an admin can run.
Well,
no. Look at the logic here. If I'm using a cloud that has Cinder support, and I'm using it to attach block devices, and in fact I'm using a half a dozen libraries that consume block devices using the Cinder API. So I'm using Cloud Foundry or OpenShift or Service Mesh or a bunch of other things. And I move to another cloud that does not have Cinder support, all of my applications are broken because I cannot add Cinder myself. If I'm using something that relies on heat and I move to a cloud that doesn't have heat, I can install heat myself.
Right. So
right.
And so I think generally in what we're trying to say, I put a note down there. I mean, that's a meta question about what are we trying to achieve with defining things as being in these core tests. And I put down here that, my view, the top level kind of thing is that these tests are meant to define a core set of capabilities that application developers can count on to be present in OpenStack distributions and deployments.
Yes.
Oh, I like that. Yes. And that's
so,
actually why I've been writing the test 6 below this during this discussion.
Yeah.
Which is what you're describing. So I think these are actually end up coupled, and I think this is actually coupled to some of the other things. But this is what I was saying in here is that, hey, if you have a test that's required as a must-pass by other must-pass tests, or it's depended on by a whole bunch of other capabilities, then it's probably a must-pass test.
Good candidate. Yeah, exactly right.
Things in Glance, right, because you can't run a whole bunch of tests without the Glance capabilities in place, are probably must-pass.
Right, so that's just
speaking generally.
I like that dependent,
right.
Rather than saying it's the admin has to install it or something else. There's a dependency among the tests.
Well, but
yeah, I don't. The thing is, I think that this is likely to remain contentious because I think that we're likely to remain in camps of people who favor the small cloud and people who favor the large cloud. And I imagine that we're not going to achieve consensus enough on that to agree that this is a good or bad capability in terms of putting it into a even if they're just weightings or recommendations. It seems unlikely to me, even just in the people on this call, that we're going to reach consensus on that one.
So
we are a lot more likely to reach consensus though if we. Can I just make a point?
Say that again, Mark.
We are more likely to reach consensus here if we keep repeating the point that we're talking about requirements for the first iteration of core. So if we start with a core that's a small cloud, that's not ruling out the future adding things like heat. But I'm perfectly happy talking about the first iteration of this being a small cloud.
And from that perspective, Mark, do you think this is a reasonable criteria?
For the first iteration, but I think that keeps getting lost here because it looks like criteria that we will continue to place.
I think
the thing is, I don't think it does, because I think there's an outstanding thing in the room, and I think that we're already to the point because of how late we are in the project's life cycle where we already have a technical community defined large cloud. Like that already exists. That elephant is in the room, right? And and to say that on a first iteration we're only going to treat with things that were maybe in Folsom, that's a little bit. I mean, they're there. Like, you know, heat's going to come up.
Monty, there is no evidence to suggest that we have resolved to a large cloud community at all. Name a single public cloud provider that runs heat.
There's a beta heat service in Rackspace.
Right. That by the first test is not going to pass, not going to qualify.
No, I'm not arguing that we have to in this accept heat. What I'm saying is that the technical community has accepted some projects that would fail this out of hand, and we know that some people aren't really crazy about that. So what I'm saying is that putting in a criteria that say that we strongly weight things that would fail things that we already know are in the integrated release, I think is a way to try and make it easier to have that argument. And I think that we just need to have that argument.
No, this process is very specifically, when we created the term integrated release, the vote at the board, agreement between the board and the TC, was that the TC was welcome to consider whatever pieces of code they would like, but that any endorsement of that as being part of OpenStack was deferred for this process. And
absolutely, I totally agree with that.
I will any basic assertion that that OpenStack has already been defined as being a large cloud. I'm not. I'm not trying to say that. I'm not saying that OpenStack is already defined as a large cloud. I'm just saying that we have things that are being developed, like not just like on the periphery, but like as they've gotten as far as the integrated release. We know we're going to have to discuss them, right? We know that we have to discuss them, and we know that we disagree on them. So I think that putting in a criteria that is weighted towards one side of that disagreement into the criteria that we're going to use to discuss those, I think that's tricky, right? I want to discuss those. I think it's very important that we discuss those. But I think that weighting in which direction we're going to fall on those discussions, I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we're there on being able to say which direction we'd like to lean. Okay, I am not emotionally attached to that criteria at all. I brought it up because I told Mark I would.
Yeah. No, I think to be honest, I was chatting about it earlier. I'm on the fence on this. I think it almost describes something that I completely agree with. So I think we're actually close to even an area where you and I disagree on what we want the outcome to be. A description of a thing where I think we're close on this. Like there's something there. You know.
What do you see that's there, Monty? What's appealing to you in this?
I do think somewhere in here the description of the things that a cloud provider running as opposed to things you run in cloud instances as an end user. I don't think this captures it fully, but I think that there is a useful distinction there in terms of, because the thing that goes obviously in my brain obviously too far to the side that most of us can agree on is definitely too far is like the WordPress as a service, right? Like that's clearly something that's content that runs in a VM, you know, and I think that, you know, Nova hypervisors are clearly in the other camp. And somewhere in here, there's a description of a thing which is a general description. And I think this is getting closer to it. I'm still not on board with it. I think this is getting closer to it.
I think Monty and I at some point are going to agree that there is a paracloud capability. I gave a talk about that 2 summits ago, maybe 3 summits ago, saying that I think there is some general orchestration and awareness of infrastructure capability that looks a bit like parts of heat. I just think heat goes too far and becomes prescriptive about that capability and doesn't have the plugin architecture. And there may be that there's some portion of that at some point would be core, and it would be used and useful by Heat and by Cloud Foundry and by OpenShift and by the entire PaaS ecosystem, and it would logically be part of the infrastructure. But there are a number of these projects that are beyond infrastructure capabilities and that become tricky in the sense of this multi-vendor ecosystem that we're trying to foster.
Well, When I look at this and sort of along those lines, I think a lot of projects have a path into OpenStack that starts as being run on OpenStack. Savannah, I think, is an example that you don't have to run, but that's sort of how it goes. And so those to me are what this is about. Savannah going to be core? If you can deploy it inside of OpenStack, it might not have to be, and therefore we shouldn't weight it highly. Heat could be is another example. But there's a benefit to having those in here. It actually speeds adoption of new projects and new capabilities, which is what we want. We want and maybe this is good or bad, I don't know. But we want capabilities to come in using the infrastructure that we're building. They're not core when they do that. And we don't want to discourage that behavior. That's actually the best.
Yeah.
We want to encourage that.
Right. Yeah, and I agree with all that.
Okay.
Okay.
I think this isn't a bad test. It just we'll refine it over time. Do you want to move it into the proposed discussion, not the consensus?
Yeah, I'll take it out of agreed upon and put it into proposed, because I think it will take more debate.
Right.
Yeah.
The counter that is the one I wrote for what I'll promote to 5 now, which is that it's pretty clearly a must-pass test if it tests something that another must-pass test relies on, or a lot of other tests rely on.
Yeah, the strong integration, I think, is the thing that you're talking about there.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know if we captured that somewhere else. I don't think.
No, I don't think we did, and I think it's valid. Sorry, we have one unnamed person adding edits in here. Can we get a name added to unnamed? Anyone? This is the one who added this is really a Juju versus Heat plea here.
Well, that was me, but I'm identified.
Really?
Yeah, no, somebody else. That might be, those colors I think just look really similar.
Okay. Well, yeah, odd. Yeah, weird. Okay, maybe, Nick, you have 2 accounts for some reason. I don't know. Anyway, that's fine. Sorry. Go ahead, Rob.
I could. Are you only allowed to edit in your thing? Because it might be me.
Oh, no, everyone can edit. I'm just curious. We have one. Somebody's labeled. That was you.
That must have been me. It was me. I'm in twice. I don't know why.
That's all right.
Weird.
Okay, we got another contentious one. Rob, I don't think anyone objects to that criteria, and I think it's just logical, right?
Yay.
Which one?
Number 5.
Everything else, it's probably core.
Hang on. I'd seen the test capabilities. Yeah.
Number 5.
Yeah, I think it's almost like we're just defining geometry there or something like that.
Gravity.
All right. Supported by common tools. Monty, do you want to argue against this?
Yeah, this is similar to the thing earlier, and actually with our discussion that these are weights and not requirements. I have almost no objection to this. I basically just wanted to bring up again that I'm concerned. Oh, sorry, no, I'm concerned that we define ourselves in terms of other people.
Right.
I don't believe that it's necessarily our job to chase what right scale thinks. However, I do believe that if we're talking about these being weights, like, hey, if this is supported by common tools, then it's probably pretty good that it's something that we keep in. Cool. Like that I'm totally on. Like, so that I think the way we've described that assuages my concerns there.
Could we do that?
I just don't want it to be
an extension.
It has to be supported by right scale, scalar, and then stratus before we'll consider it core. I think is very counterproductive.
Right, but Monty, could we include that as with item 4 and generalize 4 into like A, B's, and C's? Because what we're really doing is we're saying popularity of information is important.
Yeah,
right?
I believe you're right. I believe that what we're saying in 4 is that we, if it's used by people, for crying out loud, then we should probably consider it strongly.
I don't mind putting it A, B, C, and D, but I want to be very explicit about those 4 tests multiple public clouds, multiple private cloud products, libraries, and tools, because they don't get looked at individually often enough. And I think it's worth.
I agree with that.
Worth considering.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
This is why. Well, what I think is that I want us to be able to identify multiple subcategories, right?
Right. Okay. So
and have them be distinct.
Yeah, you can pull common libraries up there if you want. While you're doing that, can we attack this next very contentious one, the support from OpenStack communities? I am totally keen on the sentiment, and I like the addition to weighting. I have a strong objection to say must be recommended, because the point of this process being collaborative across the TC and the board and the user committee is that there are perspectives specifically from the users that they feel are not getting acknowledged by the technical community. And telling the users to go talk to the project leaders again is the kind of thing that destroyed the Mozilla community, so I don't want to duplicate that. So let's say, can we have a very strong weighting if capabilities are recommended by project leaders as must-pass, rather than saying they must be recommended by project leaders?
Yeah. Actually, I would scratch this. I would scratch this because I think we dealt with it with the veto question.
Right, there's no veto. Right. But I would say it is explicitly saying we do, as criteria, respect strong recommendations from project leaders in the TC. Because they may have in mind future development, for instance, that says, hey, we really want the entire community to standardize on using task flow. It will be easier for us to make that argument if task flow is guaranteed by being in core.
Yeah.
What you're really saying is reflect future technical direction, right?
And why do we say project leads and not project teams? Because I have much more trust in a team than in a single leader.
Sure, good point. Very good point. It's just harder to take the pulse of the team. I
think Rob's actually writing this nicely in point 6 there.
Right. I was going to change it to negative, though.
Well, no, the it should instead of can or must not, but it should reflect future technical direction.
Right. So this becomes anti-deprecation, if you will.
Well, I think that's, but no, I guess that it isn't. I think the thing that Josh said, I think is a good point, is that there can be things that the technical community or the developers are like, hey, it'd be really helpful if this is in because it's going to help us do these next things that we're wanting to do, is a potential weighting, right? Rather than the inverse, which is, or it must be suggested by project lead or whatever the other one was, So it's basically like if there's a whole bunch of folks saying, dude, you really can you? Then that should certainly be considered.
Yeah. Designate would be a great example of that. If we can get Designate into core, we will be able to build all of these other things that rely on it.
Right.
And I think we should be cautious about using core as a stick to require public clouds to deploy capabilities. I think it is the most powerful use of core, and therefore we should probably not do it very often.
Yeah, I agree. I actually just argued as a panel, I don't know, yesterday. Yesterday, and was basically saying, I think that a lot of the stick approaches these days are working much less well than the carrot approaches. And where we can carrot something and not stick it, I think that we wind up in a much richer place.
Yeah. All right, Rob, I'm 100% through the stuff I proposed. Let's look through into your stuff, or do you want to skip forward? I think let's keep going.
How long are we intending to continue, by the way?
Oh yeah, we're almost at 90 minutes. We definitely want to stop it after 2 hours.
Yeah, I blocked to 11:30.
Okay, I'm going to drop off here.
Okay.
Sorry.
I would actually like to wrap it up if we can, and let people think about it. I would add the one thing that I think is not that contentious, but maybe it is and we shouldn't do it, which would be just that the tests pass in multiple conditions. That it reliably passes in multiple cases.
Oh, you mean not non-deterministic test failures?
Well, yes, yes, but also that it's not a CI gate specific test, right? What we're looking for are things that are actually widely implemented capabilities. Maybe this is overly redundant.
I think that's the thing I was trying to get there. Is I think actually what we're finding is that the CI gate is more. There's almost nothing that's only going to pass in the CI gate.
Right. It's actually the worst environment we have.
Yeah, it is the worst environment. If your thing can pass our gate, oh my God, it's amazing. You're essentially running a cloud in a no memory, high contention, extremely high contention environment. So, but we're close to expanding the overriding capabilities that we can handle there too. So in any case, I don't think the negative of that is I'm not sure I understand what an example of that would be.
I mean, I think where this came up before in some of the discussions we had were things like, I mean, there's a set of things that might work on a DevStack VM enabled environment that the minute you go to a multi-node real world, and I can't think of a specific one, but I remember there was some concern that DevStack is not representative of a real world deployment. And right. I don't know if that's part of what this was trying to get to, was say there's going to be some, it needs to work in some other environment than a single VM deployed DevStack scenario.
I think that this concern is addressed by having a community an implementation-based approach where we're actually getting real data. We're going to have zero data if it's not widely passing in the community. Yeah.
So. And also, not to make this about CI, but it is a thing that has CI in the title. Is we are very strongly working on multi-node, real-world, bare metal deployments as part of the gate. So the fact that it's single node DevStack thing is also a temporal implementation detail at the moment.
Yeah, so I don't know that we need
combined with community things is I think gets us past this. Yeah.
Yeah, I think if we get to a point where it's a problem, we can come back to it. But I don't think we have to start out assuming that's not going to work.
Okay.
Yeah.
In the same vein, I have another criteria I would like to add, which is you do not need to have admin rights to perform a test.
So I was the one who added the admin rights, and the reason is because I think while they're not necessary for the public cloud environments, I think it is fairly necessary for the private cloud environments. And as an easy example, the capabilities of Keystone with multiple backends for things like or multi-region or cells or filter scheduler and tagging and some of those, I mean, even very simple functional things that require admin privileges. Even, in fact, even validating actual policy.json functionality of different users' permissions restrict the API calls they can make. Those are pretty key functionality for any OpenStack product and something that folks are relying on that it would be good to be able to get core definition around.
I guess the concern I have then is we're already talking about having two separate cores, a public cloud core and a private cloud core, which is a discussion.
That is specifically punted. It's actually a really good conversation, but we specifically punted it out of the cycle.
Yeah,
but my point is
that things that
require admin.
I think that, but actually,
can not open that up.
Yeah, but I think the thing is that I think that there's a long time ago when we started talking about this in San Francisco. That thing. One of the things we're talking about is by getting the scoreboard up of all of the things, then we have the collection of things that we can use to start making the mapping association with the various marks. And I think that it's entirely, it would be very weird if we required the admin things for use of a mark that only made sense in a public cloud setting. Like, we're trying to use that to communicate something, but if we are wanting to communicate information about what the private cloud experience would be, then I agree that I would like to see some consistency there as well, even if it's not something that HP or Rackspace's public clouds could have any chance of certifying on. Because it doesn't matter if they certify on that mark.
Remember that we're not creating external certification agencies. So Rackspace or HP can run these tests with their admin credentials and pass them. There is no real requirement.
Yeah, they can say we passed them. Yeah.
They can upload, certification results.
Yeah.
I guess I see value in having these in the overall scorecard instead of tests that you run, but I'm not convinced that the admin tests should be must-pass. As opposed to, it'd be nice for you to have them and publish you where you are on the scorecard so you can compare to everybody else, but that's different than having it as a must-have for core.
Well, you're thinking about only public clouds, though. For private cloud products, it's absolutely a must-have to be able to say, ACL controls work or don't.
So I think the question is not really private versus public, but more public cloud versus distribution. So there is more capabilities. We have more capability to test a distribution than we have to test a public cloud. So maybe the criteria may need to distinguish the two. I don't know.
Well, no, I think, but exactly what Rob was saying just a second ago is that these aren't external certifications. We're not going to be gating your cloud and giving you a badge or not, And so if you don't have a public accessible endpoint for testing these things, then we're not the boogeyman at the moment. We're not coming back and we're saying these are the criteria and you meet them. And if you're a public cloud and if no one's ever going to see that, you can test it and you can say, yeah, we meet that. And no one will ever know actually if that is true or not. You could just lie. It doesn't. But the thing is that no one's ever going to come chase you down and beat you up in that case because no one's ever going to interact with your thing in there. It's when somebody says, yeah, mine meets these criteria in my distribution, and you deploy it and it doesn't, that somebody's going to get angry, and that's when somebody's going to come and say, you lied to me.
So we basically agree that we are defining tests that are not, sorry. Go ahead, Rob.
Passing those tests might end up being very important for ecosystem development and commercial development of OpenStack, where somebody who's counting on those interfaces, this is what we come back to interop, who counts on those interfaces being available in order to use the cloud in a certain way, or another project might depend on those interfaces to be bootstrapped or something like that. That's a place where it's perfectly reasonable for us to have it, and it's not going to hurt the public clouds.
Yeah,
because they can.
And the other thing too, and one final thing too, is these are things where we're sort of defining those things somebody can count on. Say somebody creates a tool out in the ecosystem that helps you do a management task for your cloud that works against admin interfaces, because we've now got a mark protecting a set of capabilities that people can expect on that tool author can say, oh yeah, totally. I'm gonna write one that's gonna do OpenStack private cloud administration, and you're a public cloud, and you decide you might want to use that tool, then you can actually check and see if actually it's viable for you to use it, because if you are in support of those admin APIs, then that you can purchase out of the tool ecosystem if you chose to. And so I think it's not even I was saying words about lying earlier. I think that it's knowledge about whether or not you meet interfaces that people are expecting.
Yeah, I guess the only concern, I generally am okay with where you're going. I think you're implicitly now starting to create a public and private cloud core that's different, because you are still going to have a set of interfaces that, for instance, Rackspace comes out and says, well, we support core, except that there's some portion of that you as a customer can't access.
That doesn't matter, though. I mean, at core.
And I just don't know how we distinguish between those two. But it's fine. I just think that's what you're doing.
I definitely think we will in the next cycle have to take on this question of multiple marks. To me,
yeah.
But I also think we can make progress here without resolving that issue for this cycle.
Yeah.
So without resolving that issue, we should not accept tests or that requires admin rights.
That would make the course smaller, and I think that that's a reasonable suggestion. It's interesting because personally, I don't agree with that as a criteria, but that under that rationale, it does help us not allow tests that we don't. It keeps the course smaller. Here's my suggestion, since we're just about out of time, that what we do is we stop with this. Unless, why don't we do this? If somebody has a test they really want to make sure we discuss today, then let's do that. But I want to make sure we spend a little bit of time talking about the next meeting and communications up to the larger committee.
Can we put this test we were just debating, the admin or not, into the non-consensus discussion? Oh, yeah, it's in there.
Already did.
Oh, yeah. Sweet. Rob, I think that's a good idea. The only one that I thought we should pull forward, now I don't know if Alan's on the line for voice. He had a note in here about documentation, and that it's probably criteria that any capability we're suggesting should be core should have technical references as well as documentation for users and developers.
That's fine. Ooh.
I would love to move forward.
That sounds good to me.
That's a lot of tests. Okay. Yeah, that's that is going to create the right behavior without a doubt. Do you want to copy that up?
Yeah.
Guys, unfortunately, this is Lou. I've got to drop off.
Okay.
No problem, Lou. I think we're just wrapping up. Ooh.
Do we have a subsequent meeting time for this criteria committee?
It's next Tuesday at 1:30 Pacific.
Yeah, that's the one I tried to dial into today, by the way. It turns out that meeting is not happening yet.
Okay, Rob, do you want to talk about proposed next